Our next speaker is Katie. Katie, I forgot how to pronounce your last name. Lacadie. Katie Lacadie. Katie's originally from?
Terre Haute, Indiana.
Yeah, I should have remembered that from the radio show. But she's been here in the Metroplex for approximately...
Well, this time 10 years.
10 years. Her family consists of?
I have a daughter that's married in Tennessee, and I have 5 grandchildren. 2 of them will graduate from college this year.
Great.
So one is married now.
And her daytime hours are spent?
Studying the Word. Because I do prison ministry, I'm preparing lessons for the prison. I love to read. I love to make jewelry. I like to shop.
Me too. Help me welcome Katie Lacadie. Yay!
Thank you. I'd like to start out and ask if anyone has ever experienced just being broken. You just have tried everything, but you're just broken and you don't know how to put the pieces together. And my life, I tell people that my dysfunctional life had dysfunction in it. Even it was multiplied over several times to have this dysfunction, because I didn't ever really know what it was like to be in a functional home. At 2 years old, I remember an ambulance pulling up to our house. There were 4 of us children at the time. I was third born. And an ambulance pulled up, and I remember men in white garments going back to the back bedroom and carrying my mother out on a stretcher. And I didn't know why, I didn't know what had happened. I just know that that was the beginning of a lot of brokenness and just total not understanding what had just happened. But my mother had had a nervous breakdown with 4 of us children that were probably about 4.5 years in total that she had 4 children. And she just broke and had a nervous breakdown, is what they called it. And I found out years later at her funeral that the first year she spent in prison because they didn't have room for her in a mental institution.
Ooh.
So they put her in jail, and she had her 5th child in jail. And but Dad couldn't handle these 4 children and a pregnancy that was about to give birth to another child. So he called his sisters, I think mainly is who he called, and asked if they would be willing to take 1 or 2 of the children into their home. And so I left the first time with my older brother. He was a year older than me, and we stayed at an aunt and uncle for a year. And then they started having a family, and they wanted the extra room, and so they moved me to another aunt and uncle on the farm. And they were newly married, but they the only room that they had for me was in the attic. And so they put a bed in the attic along with all the other junk that they stored in the attic. There was no heating or air conditioning in that room. It was junk and me. And that's where I fashioned my identity of being a throwaway and something no one wanted. And it was a very scary time in my life because I spent 3 years in that attic every night by myself. And I had to turn the light off at the bottom of the steps and walk up the steps and climb into bed. And because that wasn't a bedroom with curtains and anything pretty, except stacks of junk. The light would come into the window at night and cast shadows on those things stuffed in the attic, and they became my monsters. I saw them as the monsters in my night, and I was so fearful. So I learned to sleep totally immersed under the blankets and hide from those monsters. But I didn't hide in peace. I hid, crying myself to sleep most often. And no one heard but God. Little did I know him, but during those 3 years, I lived on the farm, and my job as a little child was to go gather the eggs. And I had to go through the pig pens to get to the chicken houses and gather the eggs. And my job was to wash off the eggs and put them in crates for the store to come and pick up. And I remember my best friend during those years was their dog, Brownie. I told Brownie all my woes, and I cried many tears on that Brownie dog, and he seemed to listen with such intent and such love and understanding. He was my favorite companion. I loved Brownie, but I don't remember a whole lot of my aunt and uncle ever sitting me down and talking with me or hugging me or saying they loved me. I missed out on hearing that. And I ended up becoming very fearful and know that I experienced just a lot of abandonment and loneliness, hopelessness. I just felt hopeless. I didn't know if this was ever going to end. I didn't know what happened to the rest of my family. I did not know what happened to my mom and dad or where my brothers and sisters were. And so I remember one time Dad did come to visit me on the farm. And I remember as a little girl just holding onto his pant legs and begging him to take me with him. And he called my aunt and uncle over and said, "Take her and hold her down till I get out of the driveway." So I remember watching my dad drive off, and I did not see him for a couple years. I found out later that he called them and said, "I can't do this. I can't stand to hear her cry. So I won't be back." So towards the end of those years, I remember Dad coming and picking all of us up at the different houses we stayed in, and we moved to Muncie, Indiana. But I didn't realize now that my mother had a brand new baby. And so now there are 6 of us children, and I did not understand why our household was so chaotic and so filled with anger from my mom and yelling. But I found out later, as Dad told my older brother and I later, many years, we were in our 20s when we found out what had happened to Mom. The last year that she was in the mental institution, my dad was getting to take her out 1 weekend a month, and she became pregnant during that weekend. And so when the hospital found out about it, they gave my dad 2 options. He would either have to sign papers to abort the baby, and his visits would be canceled so that she wouldn't get pregnant again, or he had the choice to sign papers to have a frontal lobotomy, and they would release her. So he signed the papers for her to have a frontal lobotomy, and they released her with now a new baby. I was 6 years old now at the time, and there were 6 of us children and a mom that was reduced mentally to about a 6-year-old mentally, and a lot of problems because of this frontal lobotomy. And so immediately I was thrust into a position as a caretaker, and one that took care of the house and cooked and cleaned and did the laundry and took care of the rest of the children. And because I ended up loving the babies because they gave unconditional love. They didn't know the mess I was in, but they could hug me, and I could love them back. And so I always then, from that point on, just always loved being around the babies because they never judged. And they were always ready to give unconditional love. So during my growing up years, they were not years of being a child. I don't know what being a child should look like because I never had that. I watched other families. I watched them having fun. I watched them having peaceful times together, and I just secretly wanted them to adopt me. I thought maybe they might need another one. And because I didn't feel wanted, I never felt loved now. With my mom and my dad, I think he chose to just hide in his job because he didn't know how to handle what was going on in the home. In fact, I remember he came home one day and my mom was beating me, and I was the scapegoat to be beat. And she was beating me, and Dad yelled at her. And she went into her bedroom and curled up in the fetal position and cried for 3 days, nonstop. He told me later that's when I decided that I would never interfere. Because I knew that if I interfered again, that she would end up in the mental institution again, and I would have to split you all up again. So I chose to do nothing. So I ended up just wanting to survive till I became an adult. I just wanted to grow up and become an adult where I could make choices for my own life. And because I hurt for other people that were hurting, I wanted to be a nurse. I wanted to care for other people that hurt. And that was my goal as I was going to high school, was to take pre-med kinds of courses through high school. I started working after school my junior year of high school. So both my junior year and senior year I worked full time. So when I graduated from high school, I had my acceptance into Ball State University with a probation on my English skills. That's why this could be really hard. Because there was always the big red X's on my English papers, and I didn't know what I'd done wrong. So it's like, I just don't ever want to write. I didn't want to, and I was not a reader, and so I cheated on on writing book reports. I read the inside flaps and wrote my book report based on that and reading the last chapter.
That's smart.
So I thought, okay, I'm on probation and I'll probably have to work full time. So I had decided to do that, and my mother said, well, where are you going to live? And I said, well, I plan on living at home. And she said, no, you're not. You've graduated from high school, you need to get out of here. So I ended up catching the bus and going downtown Muncie, Indiana, and I went to the Army recruiter, the Navy recruiter, and the Air Force recruiter, because I knew if I joined the military, I could get my education paid for. So I made an executive decision and chose the Air Force because I liked blue and I liked airplanes. I didn't like Army Green, and I didn't want to go to sea. So I made that crucial decision in my life because of those two outstanding reasons. And so I joined the Air Force in July of 1966 during the Vietnam era. And I ended up getting stationed in Westover Air Force Base, Massachusetts. And a year and a half later, I met my future husband, but it wasn't a good situation. I had never ever drank alcohol growing up, but I had written him and told him I had fallen in love with another man. And he was writing me letters, and I didn't want to just give him a Dear John and, freak him out overseas. So I ended up telling him when he got back, and so he begged me to go out with both of us. And then he ended up getting me drunk and took advantage, and I got pregnant with my daughter. And of course the other man said goodbye because he knew we'd never had sex. This was the first time ever that I had had sex with anyone. And I was pregnant with my daughter. And at the same time, I got an assignment to go to Spokane, Washington. And I didn't officially get the report that I was pregnant going to a doctor because I hadn't wanted to do that, but I had a sense that I was. But then my husband was threatening to commit suicide if I refused to marry him. And I didn't want to have an abortion because I was raised in a strict Catholic home where abortion was wrong. And so I knew I couldn't choose to do that. And so I ended up getting married. And it was a loveless marriage on both sides, I think. He knew I didn't love him. And so he was trying everything he could to put me under control because he was afraid if I talked to another man, or he'd get mad at me if a man approached me or talked to me, and he would sometimes hurt me if I had talked with that person. So I was afraid again, and I ended up, he wanted me to stay home with the baby, and so I did. And it was during that time that he again, I felt locked in like I had been in the attic. I was not allowed to go anywhere without him accusing me of meeting with someone, or that it took too long to go to the grocery store or whatever. So it was total control during that time. What ended up happening is that he got assigned to Thailand for a year. He moved me to his home in Maine. I spent a year in Maine. We got assigned back in South Carolina, and it was not a good restart. The second day he was home, he was back, he said, "Katie, you need to go to the hospital." I said, "Why?" He says, "I think I've given you gonorrhea." And I said, "How'd that happen?" And he said, "I moved in with a prostitute for the last 6 months. And I thought I'd gotten rid of it, but you need to go." I didn't get rid of it. Thank you, but God. I went to the hospital and I didn't have gonorrhea. So, trying to work out, thinking we were trying to work out the marriage, it just wasn't working. I ended up getting a job, and we would meet at the Officers Club for cocktails, and every Friday after work they had a big splash at the Officers Club and a band and all that, and so that was our one thing that I looked forward to. But this one particular Friday, we had a whole group of people around the table, and my ex-husband liked to be the joker. He liked to tell jokes and get everybody laughing. And so this particular night, though, he gets his glass and he chinks it and he goes, "Everybody, I've got an announcement to make. I've decided, I went to a lawyer today and I decided to give my wife a divorce." So I was like, oh my God, And went home that night and he told me that I had 1 week to get off of the Air Force Base. So I got the Sunday paper and looked in the ads to see if I could find a place. And I found a room to rent from a single mom. And I went and stayed with her until I got a lawyer, and the lawyer said, "You need to go get your daughter out of there before he proves you deserted the both of them and end up having a case that you're an unfit mother." And so I went and got my daughter and applied for government housing. Ended up in an apartment that was beautiful. It was a 3-bedroom apartment. And I ended up working Social Security at the time. And then I got transferred. Actually, I asked for a transfer on the Air Force Base, and I worked on the Air Force Base as a secretary to 3 different colonels on the Air Force Base. And during that time, I'd gone through the divorce. My ex-husband had remarried a lady with 3 children, and her youngest was the same age as our daughter. So they were playmates and sisters together. So every other weekend, she went with them. And it was during that time that I ended up choosing to buy a house with my GI Bill. And I found the cutest, beautiful little house for the 2 of us, and I was so thankful. The Chief Master Sergeant that worked behind me, he went out there and planted flowers in a flower bed for me, and he mowed the lawn, and he made everything so beautiful. And there was a tree house in the back of the house for her to go up and play and have her quiet times and playhouse, and it was beautiful. It had lights and everything in that tree house, and so that was her little getaway. But the second summer, kids next door came over and said, "Can Tina come with us to Vacation Bible School?" And I said, "Well, what's a Vacation Bible School?" And they said, "Well, it's a week of camp where we do crafts, we learn songs, and we learn scriptures." And I said, "Well, that sounds like fun. Okay, she can go." So she was going, and then Thursday of that week, she came home crying. I said, "Tina, you're not going to go back. This was supposed to be fun. It's not supposed to be making you cry." So I didn't let her go back on Friday. Well, through a process, the next 6 months, I had met a man that was a fighter pilot on the Air Force Base, and he wanted to get married, and I just thought, certainly, if he knows about me, he's not going to want to marry me. I mean, my life's a mess, and everything that he had been successful. He was #1 valedictorian from Auburn University, was #1 fighter pilot, he was #1. In fact, we had decorated his den, and it was just full of his plaques and his awards for being first at everything. And he and his sister were the only 2 children in their family. He was the only son. So he said, "Katie, I want you to meet my parents in Columbus, Georgia." So we went to Columbus over Thanksgiving, and when we drove up to this nice, beautiful home in a circle driveway, his mom comes out and she takes my hand and she said, "Let me take you to your room." Wow. And she takes me to this room she must have called Doug and asked him what were my favorite colors, what did I love. because she had decorated this room as if she was expecting Princess Di to come or something. And I walked in this room and I'm just sort of amazed, it's so beautiful. And she had bought 24 of my favorite roses, which were a coral color. And she said, Katie, I'm going to go finish making lunch and then I'll come and get you. Meanwhile, get your, you can hang up your clothes and settle in. And so when she closed the door, I sat on the bed and just cried. I had never experienced love. And that's what she was doing. The kindness and love of her just melted my heart. And so during the time we were there, I watched her and her husband, and I had never seen such a beautiful marriage in all my years. And I thought, can it really be real? People can treat each other with such kindness and royalty. They treated each other like royalty. And it's like, can this be true? And so I would hide behind a wall and watch. Maybe they're different when no one's watching. So I would watch and I would see they were the same. There was nothing different. They were still just as genuine and as good. And so they invited me to come with them and to church that Sunday, and they went to a big Presbyterian church in Columbus, Georgia, and I was afraid because of the way I grew up to go into a Protestant church that there would be something drastic to happen to me. I was told lightning would strike me dead. And I thought, well, at least I experienced love. Even if I die today, I know what it is to be loved. And I went to the church, and all these people were coming up to me and hugging me, and it was like, do they know who I am? The mess that I am? And they said, we've been really looking forward to meeting you. Doug has told us about you, and we've really been waiting for you to come. And so anyway, his dad took us to the country club for brunch after church, and his dad said, Katie, can I ask you a question? I said, oh, sure. And he said, are you a Christian? I said, of course I'm a Christian, I'm a Catholic. And and he said, well, I hope I didn't offend you with that. I said, no. He said, can I ask another question? And I said, sure. He said, do you have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ? And I poked Doug and I said, what's your dad talking about? He said, I'm going to change the subject and we'll talk about it later. So we stayed, the rest of that week, and we're driving back to the Air Force Base, and Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina, and I said, Doug, I can't marry you. He said, what do you mean you can't marry me? I said, we don't have what your parents have. I said, I can't get married till I have that. I'm not going to get married many times. I only want to get married one more time. But I have to have what they have. It didn't dawn on him, because he wasn't walking with the Lord at that time himself, that it was their relationship with Jesus Christ that was shining to me. And so he was so hurt, he asked for an assignment on another Air Force base, and he was assigned in Tucson, Arizona. So I thought, well, maybe it's charisma that they have. And so this one guy I had dated before that had gotten stationed in North Carolina said, if you ever break up with Doug, I want to get back. So I called John, and so he was coming down on the weekends now. Meanwhile, I'm working at the Air Force Base, and I go to lunch at the Officers Club for lunch, and all the fighter pilots sort of took me on as their little sister, and But there was one pilot that used to sit by himself a lot. And I always felt sorry for the one rejected or left out. So I went over to Rick. I said, Rick, would you mind if I joined you for lunch? And he closed the book he was reading, and it said Holy Bible on it. I said, what are you reading? And he said, this is my time I spend with Jesus. It's my time to read. And I said, who? And he said, well, he's telling me to get out of the Air Force. And I said, but you can't. You've got a 6-year commitment. He said, well, he's told me to get out, and he's working it out. I said, you mean he talks to you? He said, Katie, has anyone ever told you about having a personal relationship with Jesus? And I said, Doug's dad asked me that, but I didn't know what it meant. So he said, well, he had a 4 Spiritual Laws little booklet tract in his pocket, and he put his phone number on the back, and he handed it to me. He said, I want you to read this, and if you have any questions, give me a call. And he said, I'd also like to invite you to church with my wife and I. And so I said, well, I'll think about it. 3 weeks later, John was staying with me that weekend. But Sunday morning, I knew I was ready not to live this way. And I went to church that Sunday, and I had read that 4 Spiritual Laws book, and the pastor was speaking, and it was like he knew me. He was reading my mail as if he was having a script, and it's like, oh my gosh. And I'm just sitting there, tears running down. He said, does anyone here want to make Jesus the Lord of their life? And I said, I do. And I got out of the seat and I ran to the front. He hadn't even asked anyone to run, to come up. I just was ready fully. And I ran up to the front. He said, young lady, do you know what you're doing? I said, yeah. I read that 4 Spiritual Laws tract, and I said, I'm getting off the throne, and I'm putting Jesus on the throne. Amen. I said, from now on, he's going to be in charge of my life, not me. I said, I made nothing but a big mess of it, and I want him. He's the one that has the plan, and I want to walk in his plan. So he said, okay, you know what you're doing. They all prayed for me. I leave. I get in the car to drive back. And I had this encounter where this heat started at the top of my head, and it was moving down like inch by inch. And I'm driving, and I said, Jesus, what are you doing? He said, I'm washing you with my blood. And when it went out my feet, he said, you are now a virgin before me. He said, will you follow me? I said, yes, Lord. Wherever you want me to go, whatever you want me to do. I'm your girl.